Welcome, everyone. Welcome to the Women in Science Spring Lecture and Luncheon. My name's Tom Sackmar, and I'm the acting president of Rockefeller University. It's not a very nice day outside, but you really look great. So thanks for coming. What I'd like to do in starting is to acknowledge the leadership of this wonderful program, the Women in Science program. And I'm going to be asking various people and groups of people to stand up to be acknowledged, but hold your applause until we identify the groups rather than each individual, if you don't mind. First, the Luncheon Chairs for today: Nancy Kissinger, Gigi Mortimer, Robin Newstein, and Sidney Schumann. The founding chairs of this organization, Isabel Furlow and Lydia Forbes, and the 54 members of the Luncheon Committee. These women have all done an absolutely fabulous job in making this our favorite event of the year on the university campus. I'd ask all of these women to stand up, please, and be acknowledged. Thank you. Thanks very much. I'd also like to say a special thanks to our honorary chairs, Brooke Astor and David Rockefeller. And the timing is perfect. They just walked in and they're now standing. And as many of you know, Brooke Astor celebrated her 100th birthday earlier this spring. Now, I'd just like to say a few words about the importance of the Women in Science initiative to us on campus, the scientists at Rockefeller University. This program has really introduced the world of Rockefeller to a wonderful new audience. And it's inspiring for our women faculty members to have this program behind them. 10 of our laboratories here at the university are headed by women. 130 of our 300 postdoctoral fellows are women, and 82 of our 169 graduate students are women. So women are well represented here on campus, but we have to do more. Funds raised through the Partners in Discovery program last year enabled us to create 8 new Women in Science fellowships, and these fellowships are greatly appreciated by our postdoctoral fellows. I'd like to ask the women faculty members here and the postdoctoral fellows and graduate fellows who are with us to stand and be acknowledged. Thank you. Now, one of the big initiatives of the Women in Science program is to create the Rebecca Lancefield Professorship, a professorship that will honor Rebecca Lancefield, who was on the faculty here at Rockefeller University for her entire career, starting in 1918. She was one of the great women scientists of her era, and it's fitting that we should honor her here with a professorship in her name. We are very proud to have today here in the audience 13 members of Rebecca Lancefield's family, and I'd like to ask them to stand and be acknowledged. Where are you? Thank you. Now, in order to establish this professorship, the university must raise $3 million. Our former trustee, Patricia Kuhl, has given us a great head start by providing a $1 million challenge grant. But in order to earn this $1 million grant, we must raise another $2 million over a 2-year period. I'm pleased to announce that we're well on our way. we've received $1.3 million to date. That includes $70,000 contributed by members of the Rockefeller faculty and staff, which indicates the importance that we give to this initiative. Now, this $1.3 million is impressive in comparison to the $800,000 that Women in Science raised all of last year. And of course, however, we do have $700,000 still needed to be raised. I'm learning a lot in my new role as acting president here. One thing I've learned is that the fiscal year begins July 1st. If you'd like to get your contribution into the current fiscal year, the deadline is June 30th. Now, to allow time for participation and questions by the audience after the scientific presentations, I'm going to refer you to your programs for complete introductions of our two esteemed speakers today. However, I will just say that Pat Kuhl is visiting us from University of Washington at Seattle, where she's the Gerberding Professor at University of Washington and the Director of the Mind, Brain, and Learning Institute there. We also are pleased that our own Professor Jim Hudspeth, the Director of the Kirby Center for Sensory Neuroscience, will start with the first presentation. And I turn the podium over at this time to Jim. Thanks, Jim.
Thank you, Tom. I'd like to thank once again all the organizers, and also like to thank all of you for coming out in somewhat inclement weather. It's very good to have you here. I know we're operating on a tight schedule. You're all putting aside time from a busy day, so we'll move rather briskly into the scientific presentation. The subject matter today is language and the way in which we use and acquire language. And I thought I would start by motivating the talk a little bit, just with a reminder of the importance of language. It's funny, but our faculty with language is so powerful, it's so pervasive, it so dominates our lives that we rarely think about it. It's something that unless one has a problem with, one simply does not pay much attention to. It's a bit like the air that one breathes. But it's worth pointing out the effort that we all make in acquiring language. During the first 10 or 20 years of life, if you think about it, you learn to ride a bicycle and to play volleyball and video games. You learn to brush after every meal. You learn to look both ways when crossing a street. But everything else you do basically is devoted to learning language. One focuses an immense amount of time in school on first learning to understand spoken language, secondly, learning to speak, on learning to read the written language, and then learning to write. Throughout life, you're involved in trying to learn to express yourself clearly, succinctly, and honestly, or in some professions, maybe not so honestly. But it is a major and all-pervasive part of our lives. Now, another way of looking at the importance of language is to see it from the perspective both of the individual and from society at large, particularly in instances in which there's a problem. As one well knows, children who have difficulties in acquiring language have an enormous difficulty in our society. And there are entire professions that are dedicated to trying to help solve these problems, the so-called learning disabilities. People like Evelyn Lipper, who's probably here and who's a strong supporter of this program, my wife Maureen Packard, they work together as professionals of exactly this sort, dealing with all kinds of children who have some disadvantage in acquiring language skills. The other striking example is those who have had language but lost it. Adults who have had a stroke or had some other accident in life that has rendered them aphasic or otherwise incapable of normal communication. And we all know how terribly painful and isolating, almost dehumanizing that experience can be. From the perspective of our society at large, and looking at it on a historical scale, it's interesting to reflect what language has done for making us what we are as a species. Just 8,000 years ago, and I'll come back to that or say 8,000 to 10,000 years ago, we did not know how to grow wheat, how to break and ride a horse, how to make pottery, how to make beer, or how to organize a city. And yet in one lifetime, an ordinary lifetime like mine, I have made bread, I have not grown wheat, but I think I could. I have broken a horse once, I've made beer once. I've never organized a city, but I'm confident I could do that. And now, all of us had these capabilities 8 to 10,000 years, basically after the beginning of civilization. And that's remarkable when you think about it. Now, 8,000 years, 10,000 years sounds like a long time, but at 25 years for a generation, that's 4 generations for a century, it's 40 generations a millennium, it's 400 generations since we didn't know how to ride a horse or make a wheel. And 400 generations, again, sounds like something, but Akihito, the emperor of Japan, has a lineage that can be traced for 125 generations. So that's a third of the way to the dawn of civilization. And there are other lineages in the Middle East and the Orient that go a far ways back to the same point. So clearly, over that few generations, we have not had genetic changes. We have been a constant species, more or less, for certainly tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, possibly 500,000 years. Everything that's happened in that 8 to 10,000 years, we owe to language. We owe to our unique capacity to pass our culture forward through verbal transmission, now through written and digital transmission. And the other animals that are out there, the newts and gerbils and manatees and what have you, they're sort of stuck where they were 10,000 years ago, precisely because they have not developed the abstract capacity that we have for promulgating what one generation learns and passing it on to the next. Now, language has 2 major components. The first is the receptive component. You've got to capture sound, say in spoken language. You've got to somehow decompose what you hear into intelligible syllables, and you've got to process it. And then the second part is actually producing language, deciding what you're going to say, manufacturing the motor program, the instructions within your brain that cause the speech to come out, and then actually implementing it. And in the 2 presentations today, we're going to focus first on the very initial steps, especially hearing, the way in which we perceive speech, and basically what goes on in our hearing process. And then Pat Kuhl will turn to a slightly higher level of processing, what goes on at a cognitive level in the brain, in the interpretation of speech, and possibly in the production of speech. So I want to start just by reminding you of what speech looks like and how complex it is. So this represents a sort of a graph of human speech. This is time. And in this top graph, we have basically an electrical signal that you would measure coming out of a microphone like the one I'm wearing now. So here is some human saying something, and you can see there are a series of discrete syllables. The thing below is more complicated, but it's worth explaining because Pat will make use of this also. It's called a sonogram. And what it is a similar pattern with time along this axis, but frequency, that is the tone that is being heard, is what is shown along the other axis. So we have some sounds that are relatively low frequencies, a few hundred cycles per second or hertz. We have some sounds that are brief and are relatively high frequencies, 8 or 10,000 cycles per second. And we can see the individual syllables with all kinds of complicated movements to them. And this is what you're hearing right now. Now, this particular piece of speech is mine, and it's actually the end of a Dylan Thomas poem, Fern Hill, of which the last verse is, "As I was young and easy in the mercy of his means, time held me green and dying, though I sang in my chains like the sea." And this piece is, "Though I sang in my chains like the sea." And you can now identify what these various components, the various phonemes, are. You can see, for example, that though, the long vowel sound, is represented by 3 relatively low frequency tones. These are called formants, and this is typical of vowels. So you see this again in ang, of sang. You see it in like. This is actually a slightly southern lack. I sang in my chains like the sea. But in any case, it's intelligible as that particular sound. The consonant sounds, particularly sibilant sounds, are these high frequencies: sang, chains, see, and the s at the end of chains. Your brain is doing this all the time. In the course of this presentation, because Pat and I will speak ever faster and faster, you will hear something like 15 or 20,000 of these phonemes go whizzing past. And if you're going to get something out of the talk, you will have to successfully capture and interpret the great majority of those sounds. So this is what's remarkable about our auditory system and about our brain, that we're able on the fly to parse out this complex welter of sounds into meaningful speech sounds and identify them bang, bang, bang at a pace of several per second. How do we do it? The organ that's involved in the capture of sound is called the cochlea. It comes from the Greek word meaning a snail, and it looks like one. This is, of course, a component of the inner ear. It's about the size of a chickpea or garbanzo bean. And one can conceptualize how it works by simply imagining simplification. Imagine you could unroll this little snail-like structure into a long, straight tube. It would be about an inch or inch and a half in length. There's a mechanical connection between each of your eardrums, the little bones of the middle ear, and finally the fluid-filled compartments inside this structure, inside the cochlea. And the key point is that along the length of the cochlea, there is a long, elastic membrane called the basilar membrane, stretching along its whole length. Now, of course, in the cochlea itself, this is wound around again and again, but you can envisage this as exactly like the ramp in the Guggenheim Museum, right? The Guggenheim has a snail-like structure, and it has this continuous ramp running from the bottom to the top. Now, how does this thing work? When you hear a sound, it, of course, reflects a change in the pressure outside your ear. And when the pressure goes up, it pushes the eardrum and the little bones in, and that drives this membrane down. When there's a decrease in pressure outside, this moves up. And in the simplest way, you can imagine that a tone would simply cause this membrane to oscillate, to bounce up and down like a plucked string on a guitar. But the remarkable thing about this particular membrane is that it's not homogeneous. Namely, at one end, the membrane is quite taut. It's rather stiff and rigid. I'm sorry, I meant the wrong end. One end, it's quite taut, it's stiff and rigid. The other end, it's rather broad and floppy. So it's like a string that magically varies from one end being like the very lowest string on a bass to the other end being the highest string on a violin. And as a consequence, when you listen to a sound, different components of that sound are spread out in different positions. So a very low frequency occurs near the top of the spiral, the very high frequency occurs at the bottom, and other sounds are spread out in between. So the three formants in my voice, in the though sound, for example, would each cause oscillations of this structure at different positions, giving rise to responses at different points along the length. Now, this, in the abstract, is a little complicated, but the reality of it is this is going on all the time in your ear. And if we'd roll the tape, please, this will give you some idea of what is really happening when you hear a real-world sound. Lights down, please. No. We want the VHS tape. So this again shows you what I've showed you before. Here's the ear, the canal, the little bones are in here. I'm not responsible for the dramatic urge here. But what I want to show you is here's the Guggenheim Museum. Here's this spiraling structure. Imagine that we can unroll it and see within it this basilar membrane. Now we can play different tones and see what happens. A low frequency tone vibrates it here, higher frequencies. And now, I'm not kidding. This is really what goes on, and it's quite amazing. As you listen to a complex sound, all of this stuff is vibrating in each of your ears, and then within the cochlea, there are specialized cells, receptor cells, that pick up that vibration and tell the brain about it. So if we could have this back, would you ready? Here again is the cochlea, the eardrum, and so on. Along the length of this elastic partition are something like 16,000 receptor cells. They're called hair cells, and you'll see in a moment why they're called that. So the notion is that any particular tone will cause a certain ensemble of those cells to be stimulated, and as again we'll see in a moment, that ensemble of cells will then communicate the information to the brain, saying, yes, I hear a middle C, or whatever it happens to be, but I do not hear a lower frequency, and I do not hear a higher frequency. What are these cells like? They're called hair cells because they have this little cluster of feelers, little processes that stick out of the top of the cell. And these processes are the mechanically sensitive part of the cell. The rest of the cell is ordinary. This is the boundary of a cell. This is its nucleus. These are various other organelles that rattle around within its interior. This hair bundle is a highly elegant structure that's organized like a pipe organ. Some of the hairs are short. As you move across the bundle, they get taller and taller. And the whole apparatus is mechanically sensitive. To give you some idea of how it moves, I have this model. This is some 40,000 times enlarged versus the real thing. And what you can see is basically it moves. It has elastic connections between the individual processes. When you hear a sound, the vibration, as I've just showed you, actually rattles these processes back and forth. So when you're listening to a middle C, the handful of cells dedicated to that particular note will be moving in time with that. If you instead listen to a high frequency, some other cell way over here at the bottom of the Guggenheim will be vibrating. If you listen to a low frequency, some other cell way at the top of the Guggenheim will be vibrating. But of the 16,000, each of them is dedicated to picking up a particular tone. They then are assigned the job of converting that tone, that mechanical vibration, into an electrical response. And the way they do that is very simple. Each of these cells has at the top of each of these little feelers a string, a little molecular connection. It's called a tip link that you see here. And it's attached to what's called an ion channel. An ion channel is simply a protein that makes a hole in the membrane. So the idea is that when you push this hair bundle in the positive direction, the little spring pulls upon the channel opens, and positively charged ions, potassium and calcium, flow into the cell and set up an electrical response. So again, it's just like the model. Here's a channel. It's got a hole in it. No big deal. It's got a gate. It can be closed or it can be open. It's got a spring. Okay? If you imagine this thing sitting in the hair bundle, as the hair bundle moves back and forth, this little gate pops open and closed. And honest to goodness, that's what happens. Each of us has in each of our 16,000 hair cells 100 or so of these little molecules, these ion channels, that let the ions flow in and out, and by that means set up electrical stimuli. And finally, the information needs to go into the brain. So here's again the ensemble of 16,000 hair cells. Each of those has one or a handful of nerve fibers, which are these stripes that run down to the brain, which is not shown here. So these will represent the highest of frequencies, these will represent the lowest of frequencies, and so on in between. And again, if we play one particular tone, a middle C or whatever, just these cells will be activated, and just these yellow nerve fibers will be the ones that send impulses on into the brain. This is what happens when things are working right. What happens when things go wrong? 10% of our population have functionally significant hearing problems. The impact is enormous at all stages of life. It's enormous in children in the acquisition of language, and Pat will particularly highlight that in her presentation. In the elderly component of our society, hearing loss can often be a source of isolation from friends and family, so it's terribly important that it be remediated. And for those of the middle years of life, unexpected hearing loss from a loud sound or from a viral infection can be quite devastating because, as Helen Keller put it, blindness, which has a lot of impact on us, blindness deprives us of our contact with things, but deafness deprives us of our contact with people. And the mild interactions we have every day with people, the banter before this presentation, the conversations at lunch, are terribly important in situating us all in our social milieu and reminding us of whom we are. So people abruptly deprived of that experience a loneliness that's very hard for the hearing community to appreciate. So ears wear out. A number of things can damage them, deranging the elegant hair bundle into this disheveled mass. And unfortunately in humans, these cells are not replaced. So as the hair bundle is lost, it's lost for good. And with it goes middle C or D sharp or whatever frequency happens to be represented by that particular cell or group of cells. Among the things that can cause such damage are first more than 100 genetic conditions in many families, various kinds of infections such as rubella. There are drugs that cause this. It's a major side effect of drugs like tobramycin and gentamicin, which are used in some life-threatening infections. But it's also the major side effect of exposure to cisplatin, which is the major chemotherapeutic agent that must be used in dealing with ovarian cancer. So many women, in fact, have experienced a partial or complete hearing loss because it was that a necessity versus a risk of life with such a severe tumor. Finally, loud sounds can damage the cells, and simple aging, the phenomenon known as presbyacusis, or the hearing of old men, gradually whittles away at our cells throughout life. So one of the questions we and others are interested in is what can be done about this. Now, in the short term, there are modalities already available. As long as there's some surviving hair cells, one can use a hearing aid to augment the sound that reaches the survivors and produce a reasonable simulacrum of normal hearing. The second thing that's a very effective modality is American Sign Language, or ASL. This is a language that's developed independently of English. It's seen by linguists as distinct as French, as distinct as Swedish, or some other language from English. So it's not simply a copy, it's in fact a new thing on earth. And it's a terribly valuable new thing. As I'm sure many of you know, the facility that people have with ASL rivals that of people who are using speech. And the nuances and jokes, the subtleties that can be communicated are at least as great as those of an ordinary language. A long-term hope, and one that many researchers are working on, is regeneration. In so-called lower animals, in this case a chicken, these hair cells can grow back after being destroyed. So this is a chicken that was exposed to heavy metal, and this scar across the middle represents a region in which the hair cells were devastated. So these large things here are hair cells with their hair bundles, these clusters sticking out, that are still intact. But all through this middle region, the hair cells were totally destroyed. But as you can see, tiny new hair bundles are growing back throughout this region, replacing the old ones. And in a few days, this chicken will be able to appreciate music again as much as it ever did. So we would like to learn in humans what are the genes that control this, so that we can switch back on the capacity to proliferate and make new hair cells to replace the damaged one. Another possibility along the same routes is the use of stem cells to introduce embryonic type cells from outside and let them grow and produce hair cells. The other thing that already exists and is quite remarkable is the cochlear prosthesis. And the idea of the prosthesis is very simple. In normal hearing, as we've seen, we have the 16,000 cells, each connected to nerve fibers carrying a particular set of frequency information. Here's an individual who has lost all of his or her hair cells, perhaps from exposure to cisplatin or a severe drug. Such an individual would, of course, be totally deaf, and no hearing aid could help because there are no surviving cells whose inputs can be stimulated. But imagine that you could make tiny electrodes, tiny wires, and simply connect those wires to individual nerve fibers. When this one is stimulated, the brain would say, I hear a high frequency. Here a somewhat lower frequency, lower and lower. So here the red channel is active, this nerve fiber is active, and that corresponds, as far as the brain knows, to stimulation of this particular hair cell, even though it's long gone. So this works. People have made cochlear prostheses that look like this. These are simply small plastic inserts that fit within the ear's chambers. They have pairs of electrodes through which current is passed from one to the other to stimulate the nerve fibers. There are now 50,000 people on Earth who were totally deaf who use these devices. They can understand a lecture such as this. Many of them can talk on the telephone. It's a remarkably effective device. And of course, it's an exciting step in prosthetics because we hope similar things can be done for the blind, for the paralyzed, and so on by the use of similar technology. So the last thing I want to do is play you a brief demonstration of what using such a prosthesis might be like. Now, the remarkable thing is we should have 16,000 hair cells and more nerve fibers than that. This device has only something like 6, 8, 10, 12, or 20 channels of information, a far smaller amount of input. And yet one can understand reasonably well what comes through with this limited amount of information. So the last demonstration is a snippet of tape, and if we have the right first speech segment, we will have a conversation between two people in which all the information has been thrown away except for 6 channels of information. So it'll sound very fuzzy, but let's hear the first part.
What are you doing? Oh, preparing a lecture. Howard Hughes Medical Institute is sponsoring 4 talks on sensory transduction as this year's holiday lectures.
That sounds like a valuable way of acquainting students with interest in the results pertaining to the senses.
So that's pretty bleak, but it's only 6 channels. Now the same conversation with 12 channels.
Oh, preparing a lecture. Howard Hughes Medical Institute is sponsoring 4 talks on sensory transduction is this year's holiday lectures.
That seems like a valuable way of acquainting students with interesting new results pertaining to the senses.
Still murky. Now 20 channels, which is what contemporary prosthetic
What are you
devices
doing?
have.
Oh, preparing a lecture. Howard Hughes Medical Institute is sponsoring 4 talks on sensory transduction as this year's holiday lectures.
That seems like a valuable way of acquainting students with interesting new results pertaining to the senses.
And finally, the original tape.
What are you doing?
Oh, preparing a lecture. Howard Hughes Medical Institute is sponsoring 4 talks on sensory transduction as this year's holiday lectures.
That sounds like a valuable way of acquainting students with interesting new results pertaining to the senses.
So the point of this is that I think most of you could get something out of at least the third segment. Even with only 20 channels, you can understand some speech. And of course, if you were wearing a device and using it routinely, you would understand much more after some learning. So it is amazing that such a device works. It's a tribute to our language processing capacity that we can dig information out of such a garbled signal. Now, the use of these devices, as I'm sure you know, is controversial, and I don't have time to talk about that now, but I recommend to you, if you get a chance to see it, the film called Sound and Fury that's being shown sometimes on television. It's a very nice documentary dealing with families confronting a crisis on whether they should or should not use this cochlear prosthesis. But as I said, that's a subject for another day. So I thank you for your attention. So as Tom has already said, in our slimmed-down version of presentations, we do not have elaborate introductions, but I'm very proud and pleased to be able to introduce Pat Kuhl. It's already been said that she's from the University of Washington. She's finally, very kindly flown across the country to be with us today, and also will be presenting a scientific lecture to our faculty and students tomorrow. Patricia.
Thank you, Jim. Thank you. I'm very, very excited to be here today, and I want to thank all of the members of the committee, of the Women in Science Committee, for the wonderful work they're doing. It's so important to encourage women to choose science as a career, and I think that the committee's work is really making a difference, not just here at the Rockefeller University, but throughout the country. So thank you very much for the work that you do. Speaking of scientists, let me introduce you to one. I will, throughout this lecture, try to convince you that babies in cribs behave like scientists, that they're not only learning as a tape recorder would record sound or record video information, but they're learning by taking very complicated measurements on the things that they see and the things that they hear. The work that we're doing in developmental science is creating a revolution in our understanding of how learning transpires. And we're going to take information that the baby receives, the elegant machinery that Jim was describing. Babies have this elegant machinery in place in the last 10 weeks of pregnancy. As a fetus, the last 10 weeks, information of that kind, this complicated dance that's occurring at the end organ on the basilar membrane, is communicating the information, sending it up to the brain, and the brain is acquiring information based on that elegant transmission. So that's what we're going to be talking about this morning. And I'll try to convince you that the revolution that we're heading toward in the next decade will be comparable to the sea change that's occurred with the technology explosion that's occurred in the last 2 decades. And for the Genome Project, the kind of change in our knowledge is going to be equivalent to what we're learning about the infant mind and brain. There are 3 things, 3 aspects of society that are contributing to this change in our understanding of the human mind and brain, and particularly the developing mind and brain. They come from 3 sources. One is the academic world. You've all been watching television programs and reading magazines that show you brains lit up as we process information. The thing that changed our understanding is that we can now look at alive, awake brains instead of dead brains. When I was a graduate student, you could only look at a dead brain, and we're now learning what's happening in the brain as information is sent up and processed. The second is business. The business community is very interested in child learning, not only because children will be interacting with computers, but because companies, like there's a small software company in Seattle whose former CEO is very interested in creating computers that are doing intelligent things like listening and producing sound. Bill Gates is very interested in children and how they learn, because he's hoping that smart machines will capitalize on the same kinds of information to help computers behave in a smarter way. Finally, society itself has turned its attention to the child and learning. The magazine covers have given full play to infants. What do they know and when do they know it? And we're all surprised by the information that we're learning. There have been 2 White House conferences over the last 4 years, both sides of the aisle interested in how children learn. The first was in 1997, the Clinton administration, Mrs. Clinton and the then President Clinton, and I spoke to that group. And then again in 2001, the Bush administration ran a conference called Cognitive Development. Everyone's interested, particularly the policymakers, in the kinds of things that we're learning about children. So what are the studies telling us? Well, they're telling us that the baby at birth is a very sophisticated person, very sophisticated perceptual system. And I'll give you examples today from the area of language. And then this sophisticated individual starts to learn as experience from the world enters the sensory system and is sent to the brain. The kinds of learning that we're discovering is not typical learning, a classroom situation in which information is fed to you explicitly and you're rewarded for acquiring that information. What's happening is that babies are taking very sophisticated measurements of the input. We can demonstrate in studies that babies are taking statistical measurements. They are paying attention to the distribution of sounds that they hear. They pay attention to transitional probabilities. And it changes their perceptual systems. Experience alters the brain to make language easier to perceive for the members of each culture. And I'll demonstrate that to you in a series of experiments. So how do we know this information about babies? How can we tell what they perceive early in life and how that's altered by listening to a particular language? Well, I have laboratories in 5 different countries, and we're studying infants growing up in Japan, in Russia, in Sweden, and Finland, and in the United States. And you can't learn about language in the brain by just studying American babies listening to English. We need to study babies all over the planet and see how nature's experiment turns them into a speaker of Russian or a speaker of Spanish or French. And we're doing tests of the kind I'll show you in a minute. A baby sits on his mom or dad's lap. There's an assistant located to the baby's right, and the assistant is playing with toys that come out of a box, and she brings them up one at a time and keeps the baby's interest towards that side. At the same time, there's a loudspeaker on the left presenting a sound like ah, ah, ah. The baby's job is to listen for that sound to change, and as soon as they detect a sound change, move from paying attention to her to paying attention to this loudspeaker, and something on top of the loudspeaker will light up when the baby turns at the right time. Let's see how this baby's doing.
Can a baby as young as 6 months old hear the difference between 2 vowels? This baby is trained to look for the toy when the sound changes. She's being distracted, so she'll turn only when she hears the difference in sounds. The key question, will she turn before the toy lights up?
E, 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 E.
That baby's not only very smart, but having a wonderful time in this little experiment. So what have these studies all over the world taught us? Well, they've taught us 2 things. The first is that babies all over the world are citizens of the world at birth, meaning that every sound of every language can be perceived as different by the youngest babies. Between 0 and about 6 months, we are all citizens of the world. Now, why is that remarkable? Well, it's remarkable because you and I cannot do that. You and I are very culture-bound listeners. We hear the distinctions of our own language beautifully, but we have a lot of trouble hearing the distinctions of a foreign language. Let me illustrate. I don't know if there are any Hindi speakers in the audience, but I want you to listen to these 2 sounds and see if you hear them as the same or different.
Dha, 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 dha.
Do they sound the same or different? The same. To a baby at under 6 months, these sounds are as different as ba and pa. They are as different as ra and la. Our brains have been altered by experience to make those two sounds fall into the same category. But to a Hindi speaker, they are totally separate. Now, the next two slides I'm going to show you, I've put in here because I sat next to Henry Kissinger at dinner last night, and we talked about how perception changes reality for us. And I wanted to illustrate in these two slides. I was told that Rockefeller audiences can handle these complicated slides, and so I trust that you'll be able to follow. Remember Jim told you about formant frequencies. This is a diagram simply showing you that each of these dots in a space is a different syllable. They range from ra on this side to la on this side for American speakers. And each of them, we are altering the formant frequencies, F3 and F2, but that's a technical detail. The main point is that they're physically equally separate from one another, and if perception mirrored reality, acoustic reality, speakers of different languages would hear a gradual change from ra to la in all cases. But here's how perception works. Depending on, you can measure this in many different ways, but if you plot how people perceive the sounds in the grid, the American world looks like this, and the Japanese world looks like this. Americans hear two tidy categories, very clustered around the most popular ra, very clustered around the most popular la, and a big gap between them. That's not physical reality. Physical reality was this equally spaced world. Japanese adults hear it very differently. One category, not two. Their language contains only R, not L, so everything's lumped into one category. The brain develops these kinds of maps early in development, and they serve as a kind of filter on your experience. As an American, you have no trouble hearing the difference between words like rake and lake. As a Japanese adult, rake and lake belong to the same entity. So perception is warped by experience, and no one perceives physical reality. We're all walking around with filters in our brains that organize language easily and readily for us. And Henry's comment last night was that politics is just the same. What makes being a Secretary of State difficult is that we're all walking around with different maps, not just for language, but how we perceive the world in general. Okay, so then let's get back to the babies. When do these maps develop? When do you change from the citizen of the world status you started as to the culture-bound listener that you now are? The answer? Very, very early, before your first birthday. Okay? Here's the evidence. This is a study we've just completed in Japan. We're testing babies on the perception of ra and la, testing them in America, in my American lab, and in the Japanese laboratory. At 6 to 8 months, the babies are equivalently good, about 65%, well above chance. They're handling this task quite well. Look what happens 2 months later, between 8 months and 10 months. Recognize they haven't said their first word yet. It's before words begin. The American babies are going straight up, and the Japanese babies are getting very poor at this task. So before the first birthday, babies all over the world are doing some very special processing, this statistical analysis of the input, and learning which sounds are contained in the language and which are not. Now, what happens if this is a very incredible time for learning? Can we keep the babies open to foreign languages? Can we keep them receptive to the sounds of American English if they're Japanese, or Chinese if they're Americans? Let's have a look. Here's another study we completed in Taiwan and in the United States. We were looking at a Mandarin-Chinese contrast. In my lab, the Chinese graduate students laughingly refer to it as the Shishi contrast because us Americans cannot hear it as different, but the Chinese students find it very easy to hear the distinction. Again, we see the same pattern. The Taiwanese babies are going straight up between 8 months and 10 months, getting very good at it. The American babies are getting poorer. Well, what if we stimulate the American babies with Chinese during this period of time? In a study that we've just completed, The babies were brought in at 9 months to the laboratory, and my Chinese graduate students would meet them at the door and bring them upstairs and speak only Chinese to them on the floor, playing with toys. This is not an instructional class in Chinese. This is just fun on the floor with objects and toys and books. And they came in for a month, 12 times, each time 25 minutes, and listened to Chinese. And we had a control group that came into the laboratory just as frequently, same books, same toys, but heard English instead of Chinese. What happened? At the end of the period of exposure, we retested the babies who'd been exposed to Chinese. They still couldn't do anything more with the Chinese contrast. But what happened to the babies who were exposed for less than 5 hours to Chinese? They're up here. Basically equivalent to the babies in Taiwan. So this period of time is an extraordinary period in which kids are mapping the sounds of language, and this occurs prior to the time that they produce their first words. We can also take brain measures on the babies after the experience. The baby's wearing a little bonnet, and in the bonnet are electrodes that record from the scalp the potentials that are created in the brain as the baby processes the sound. And we can see after the experiment, these are the locations in the cap where each electrode was recording. And when the red line exceeds the green line, babies are showing evidence of discrimination of the two sounds, the two Mandarin sounds. Here are the babies exposed to Mandarin, and here are the babies exposed to English as a control. Every single record is showing that the red line is above the green line. Babies all over the brain, the babies reacting to the sound change of Chinese, whereas the babies in the control group do not show that pattern. So we can see that we've changed the brain of the baby with just 5 hours of experience with Chinese. Why is the baby brain so good at this? It's partly because throughout the brain, this is a slide taken from Peter Huntenlocher's work, showing that in early development, the synaptic connections are being formed at a furious rate. By the age of 3, this thicket of connections, the telephone wires running between cells, there are 3 times more of them than in the adult brain. 3 times as much glucose is burned by the 3-year-old brain in comparison to our own. And it isn't until puberty that this thicket thins itself through a pruning process to solidify the connections that that child will continue to use as an adult. There's a lot to learn about the relationship between these physical connections in the brain and the kinds of things I'm talking about today. The next decade we'll be trying to relate the physical changes that are occurring with the behavioral changes that I'm talking about. So what are we doing to assist learning? Obviously, adults are speaking to babies. Babies are mapping the sounds that they hear. What is it that we do that bring an infant's attention to sound and help them understand what the sounds of their language are? Well, again, if you've been looking at your magazines and looking at television programs, you know there's a phenomenon called motherese, and often called fatherese too, because fathers do it as well, and to be totally politically correct, caretakerese, because all caretakers seem to use it. It's a strange sounding pattern. When you plot the pitch of the voice, which is what we're doing here, and you listen to a mother talking to another adult, adult-directed speech and infant-directed speech, they are quite different signals. Here's the mother talking to a lab assistant. I had a little bit, and the doctor gave me Bendectin for it. She's right around 300 hertz, where females typically are. And then she turns to her 2-monther and she says, "Can you say ah?" Say ah. Hey, you. Say hi. Hi. I cannot do this without a baby in my arms. Well, what we've learned about this signal is that babies love it. They will choose it. If you give them a choice between infant-directed and adult-directed speech, they will choose hands down to turn in the direction required to produce infant-directed speech. And even when you replace the entire speech with just the tone that follows the pitch, so babies hear as opposed to they will choose the voice pattern that correlates with infant-directed speech. Now, we've also learned that it's not just these pitch contours that these hook the baby's attention. We're convinced of that. But it turns out when you measure the sound units themselves, the E, ah, oo, that's phonetic transcription, we're plotting formant frequencies, that the red triangle is bigger. The voice you use when you speak to an infant actually has bigger acoustic distinctions than when we speak in the blue triangle to each other. It's actually clear speech. We clean up our act when we talk to infants. We think it helps the brain learn. There's evidence that if you stretch sounds in the way that we do when we speak to infants for 8 to 11-year-olds who have dyslexia, that it actually improves their perception of speech and improves their language scores in general. Again, I'm putting this up for Henry's benefit. Madeleine Albright was at one point advised that if she really wanted to make a difference with certain members of Congress, that she ought to be using the motherese pattern because it improved communication. Might be true of all secretaries of state, I don't know. We are also doing studies on adult speakers. We have learned that children are very supple and plastic, and we can alter their brains with a certain kind of experience. We're now looking at the brains of adults using what my students love to call the hairdryer from hell. This is an MEG device, magnetoencephalography, and it allows us to look at the magnetic fields created in the brain as you're thinking, listening to music, or listening to language. And interestingly enough, some of the principles of motherese, motherese has often gotten a bad rap as a sort of baby talk. But when you really look at how parents speak to children, caretakers speak to children, this clear speech has a lot to do in improving your ability to acquire a second language as an adult. So these are experiments that are ongoing at the moment, and we're also in the process of creating a baby MEG device. It'll be the first in the world, and we're doing pilot experiments on that right now. So my final example is to provide you with evidence of the kind of learning. I've been talking all through this presentation about automatic learning. It's not explicit learning. It's the kind of learning that you do without having any attention put to it. I'm going to give you a little demonstration in which I create an auditory visual illusion for you. Those of you who have ever seen a dubbed movie, I'm sure everyone in this audience has seen some dubbed movie. It's very odd, isn't it, to see a Japanese person speaking English. If you go to a foreign country and you're watching the dubbed movies, it's very strange. Why is it strange, and why is it difficult for the brain? Well, because as a young child, we combined our listening abilities and the maps we were building with our view of the face, and we learned to correlate what face movements were occurring and the sounds that we heard. So if you combine things, a visual image with an auditory sound that it doesn't go with naturally, your brain has to do something to contend with that mismatch. What I'm going to demonstrate to you in a very quick experiment is that when you combine the auditory signal for baba with the visual mouth movements appropriate for gaga, your brain doesn't go with either the auditory or the visual, but it combines them. It marries them into something that's an illusion midway between the two that you actually received. Your auditory system was processing this, your visual system was processing this. The percept is something midway between da-da or da-da. This is an old videotape that I made for Bill Gates to convince him of this phenomenon. So let's see what happens. I'll have, the instructions are on the tape. Basically, you'll be listening for a little bit to hear what your auditory system reports, and then I'll have you open your eyes and see what happens. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to produce a nonsense syllable 20 times in a row, the same thing. What I want you to do is when I say okay and begin to pronounce that nonsense word, close your eyes and just listen for about 5 repetitions. And then open your eyes and see whether, when you open your eyes, the word that you hear changes. If you behave like the subjects in my experiment, what you'll hear with your eyes closed is the nonsense word baba. But when you open your eyes, you will hear that change to something more like da-da or da-da. Okay? Here we go. All right, close your eyes. Baba. 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 Okay, open up. Baba. 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 Okay, open and close and see Baba whether you can make it go away. Baba. Baba. Baba, 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 Baba. Okay, that's it. I hope it worked. Okay, so for how many of you did the sound change when you opened your eyes? Okay, if not, see me later. There may be something wrong with your brain. So you see how powerful early learning is. This combination of vision and audition is something that you learn very early on by watching talkers speak. It's not something that you can turn off. This is a mandatory effect. Even when we combine a big male with a big neck with a tiny little female voice. So you see this big guy on the videotape and he's going, Baba, Baba, Baba. And the observer will say, that guy wasn't producing that sound, was he? And you say no, but your brain cannot turn off the combination of visual and auditory information. When your eyes are open, you'll take it into account. Why is that so ingrained in you? Because we demonstrated in 1982 a kind of phenomenon related to lip reading in 18-week-old babies. In this experiment, babies are watching two faces move their lips silently. On the one side is a mouth going ah-like movements. On the other side, E. And they're moving together and silently. Baby sitting in an infant seat, everything but the popcorn, watching the movies. And then we turn on a sound midway between the two faces. And the baby has no way of knowing, without knowledge in their brains, which side is producing the sound. So we have a camera trained on the baby's eyes. And we watch, once we turn the sound on, which face is the baby going to look at? And when we turn ah on, the babies will go to the mouth pronouncing ah. And when we play E, they'll go to the mouth pronouncing E. And that's in an 18-week-old baby. So from the beginning, you're tying these two signals together, and that's why the auditory visual illusion is so compelling. All right, to close, my colleagues and I have written a book called The Scientist in the Crib. We really do believe that the scientists refer to two people, both the babies and ourselves. In order to learn about the origins of the human mind, the scientists got into the crib because it's one of the best ways to understand how the mind works. And when we got in there, we understood that what was looking back at us from the crib was indeed another scientist, taking measurements, learning something about the world, not only about language, as the book portrays, not only about language, but about humans and how they relate, the social emotional context in which we communicate, and also about objects in the world and how they operate. At the Center for Mind, Brain, and Learning at the University of Washington, my husband and I are co-directing a center in which we take an interdisciplinary approach to the child. Not just neuroscientists, but behavioral psychologists, linguists, speech and hearing scientists, computer scientists who help us model this business that we see going on in the human brain, and educators, because we're truly convinced that what we're learning about the child will affect what happens in homes and in schools eventually. So we hope that by studying the human mind and brain, particularly of the developing child, we'll learn not only great secrets about themselves, but some deep truths about our own minds and brains and how we develop. Thanks very much for your attention. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Stay here.
I guess we could just close that.
That was absolutely fabulous. I hear about 200 scientific presentations a year, and those are two of the best you will ever hear. Thanks again, Pat and Jim. We do have a few minutes for questions. If anyone has a question to address to either Pat or Jim or both, we'd like to hear from you. In the back, way in the back.
Repeat the question if it's faint.
In children that are precocious in language development, where they are making real words, say, between 6 and 8 months, is that window of development closing earlier?
I think it's an interesting question. If everybody heard the question, it's whether or not kids who are early in word development, is their window closing earlier? There's no evidence yet that it is. Word learning certainly bootstraps on this early sound perception and uses some of the statistical relations between sounds to discover words in the input. And so kids who are precocious, you can predict precociousness in language by these early tests at 6 months. So the little sound perception tests that you saw that we're running in countries all over the world, if you take that measurement at 6 months and then look at children at 13, 16, 20, 24 months, the kids who are best at sound perception are also further ahead in language, phrase perception, word understanding, word production. So this is the front end of the language machine at work, and it seems to predict end skill, but it may not predict exactly the speed at which various things are achieved.
Way in the back.
The notion of tone deaf, is it perception, is it something within the vibrations? Can you describe what that means when someone's tone deaf?
Yeah, it's interesting. The question was, what is the nature of tone deafness? And a related question is, what is special about people who have perfect pitch, or have sort of the opposite extreme? And that story is developing very much along the lines of what Pat just told you about language. There first were investigations asking whether the ears of people were different, whether tone-deaf people had funny ears, whether people with perfect pitch had somehow superior ones. There's not a whit of evidence for either of those. All of our ears seem to be created equal. But what does change is experience and our cognitive ability to appreciate tones. So some people have recently found that young kids have much better tonal perception, something more like absolute pitch, than most adults do. And they seem to lose it with time. So it's somewhat like the categorization that Pat was talking about in language sounds. We use the language sounds that we don't exercise, and some people think that we lose our ability to perceive pitch if we don't exercise that. Again, the experiment now needs to be done. It may well be proven that exposing children to more music earlier or pushing musical skills earlier will be beneficial for them in maintaining better pitch perception.
It's often said that girls learn verbal skills earlier than young boys. Actually, it's often said we never shut up. But
We see gender differences as soon as vocabulary is acquired. We haven't seen it so far in this beginning sound perception stage. Boys and girls seem to be equivalent. But as soon as you acquire words, girls seem to have a greater vocabulary and greater phrase understanding earlier, and it doesn't end up equivalent until about, I'd say about second grade. Second grade, you can begin to see boys catching up with girls in the verbal skills. And who knows whether that's a matter of use or whether it's a matter of how the brain is wired. We know there are very strong differences between the language areas in male and female brains. The brains of males are more focused language operations in the left hemisphere, whereas women have the language areas more distributed across the two areas. And it puts boys somewhat at risk, because if the language areas, if the left hemisphere is damaged, there is no other area to take over. And it's possible that that is correlated with the fact that stuttering, autism, and dyslexia are between 4-to-1 and 10-to-1 more frequent in boys than in girls. Now, we're just learning about the development of hemispheric specialization, and it doesn't appear to be, the left hemisphere is not dedicated to language early in development, but within about 2 to 3 months, it looks like the left hemisphere takes over. So it may be initial experience that sets that up. So the exact source of the differences between male and female brains for language isn't understood, but that's our current belief about it.
My question is for Professor Jim. I noticed in the presentation that there was an emphasis on calcium and potassium. Should we be feeding our children any particular kinds of foods that would enhance those?
So those two ions are both important in the signaling of all of our nervous system, not just in hair cells and in our visual cells, but in all our nerve cells and everywhere else. It's of course essential to have the right amount of potassium, the right amount of calcium, and of sodium, the other major ion that plays a role. But in a normal diet, one gets plenty of all of those things. Indeed, in anybody who has a sufficient imbalance that the ear would be disturbed, you would have much more profound symptoms. A person would have real problems with consciousness and the like. So anybody who is here, anybody who is up and functioning and talking and so on is getting plenty of those. That's not something to be worried about. There's nothing that can be added to the diet to enhance it. The only thing I think you can do to the diet to help is to keep them away from heavy metal music.
Hmm?
My son has had ear infections during his first year of life. Does that slow down the process?
It appears that it does. Otitis media in the first year. You can imagine if all of this work is being done by the brain with sound in the first year, that anything that would change the child's ability to do that processing might slow the process down. So even though otitis media only gives you about a 30 or 40 decibel decrease in hearing, it's not so permanent and it's not so deep, it still seems to slow the process down. Children are a little bit less good who have had frequent ear infections in the first year.
But you can add one comment to that, and this is a comment based on what we know about the visual system, and actually work from Torsten Wiesel, who is the former president here. And what he and his experiments found is that if you deprive an experimental animal of vision for a certain portion of its early life, its visual development will also be retarded, but it catches up. So one should not worry too much about this, because what happens is the nervous system remains plastic, it remains flexible for longer, and the pruning of neural changes that Pat alluded to is simply pushed later. So it's not that devastating an affair.
Let me just make one more comment related to that. You know, this whole business of the critical period, windows of opportunity that open and close, we used to think they were very absolute, that there was some clock, hormonal clock, turning them open and on and then off, and learning wasn't possible. We now see that it's experience itself, these maps that I'm talking about, they are driving your ability, and if those maps are developing more slowly, the period is extending over which you can learn. So again, it says, as Jim just said, don't worry about it, because while it slows it down, it doesn't alter it forever.
I think we should end the presentation phase with thanking Pat and Jim for an outstanding presentation.